Welcome to Unit 3, Exercise 8-1, Yield and Yield Rates. This is making use of the second of our three pyramids. Luckily enough, all three work the same way. So if you look at our yield percent pyramid, the value on the bottom left is yield, on the other side is as purchased, and on top is EP, or edible portion, or menu amount, or yield amount, or what have you. Essentially what we have is here's how much of the ingredient we purchased, here's how much we have left once we've trimmed or boned or skinned or peeled, what have you, and then we can get the yield percent. How much do we now have left from what we began with in percent form? Let's take a look at this on one of our charts. Question number 1, we have asparagus. We purchased the AP weight. We purchased 14.5 pounds. We had a trim loss of 5.5 pounds. Trim loss is the amount that we cut away, trimmed away, cooked away, what have you. The yield weight is, again, the edible portion, how much we now have left. And then, of course, the yield percent will show us in percent form how much we have left. So let's do the first one using the asparagus. We started off with 14.5 pounds. We trimmed away 5.5 pounds. So our yield weight, or our edible portion, is 9 pounds. We then take our EP of 9 pounds, we divide it by 14.5, we get a yield percent of 62. So 62% of what we originally purchased is what we now have left for our customer. Let's go take a look at the broccoli. We purchased 27 pounds. We trimmed away 10 pounds and 10 ounces. We're going to convert the ounces into the decimal equivalent in pounds by dividing the 10 ounces by 16, the amount of ounces in a pound. So we have our AP weight of 27 pounds minus 10.625 pounds, the decimal equivalent of 10 pounds, 10 ounces. It gives us 16.375 pounds. If we multiply decimal 375 by 16, we get 6 ounces. So we have 16 pounds and 6 ounces as a yield weight, or edible portion. So we come over here and we get the 16.375, our EP amount, or yield weight. We'll divide it by our AP weight and we get a 61% yield. So let's take a look at the cabbage. We purchased 18.25 pounds, or 18.25 pounds. We trimmed away 3 pounds, 12 ounces. 12 ounces is 3/4 of a pound, so 12 ounces is 0.75 pounds, or again, 12 divided by 16 will get you the number you're looking for. So 18.25, or AP weight, will take away the trim loss of 3.75, and that leaves us with 14.5 pounds. 0.75 times 16 ounces gives us 5 ounces. So our EP of 14.5 pounds, we'll divide that by our AP weight of 18.25 pounds, and we get a yield percent of 79. Looking at cucumbers, we bought 8 pounds. We trimmed away 21 ounces. So I converted my 8 pounds into ounces. 8 pounds times 16 gave me 128 ounces. You subtract the 21 ounces that we trimmed away, we're left with 107 ounces as an EP. So our EP 107 ounces divided by our EP, or AP, of 128 ounces gives us a yield percent of 84. Here with the honeydew melons, we bought 6 2-pound melons. 6 melons, each weighing 2 pounds. So we actually bought 12 pounds of melons. Here we're not given the trim loss, but we are given the EP weight, or the yield weight. We started off with 12, we ended up with 8.5. So to figure out the trim loss, let's do our 6 melons times 2, which will give us 12. We'll subtract our yield amount, or EP, and we notice that our trim weight is 3.5 pounds. To get the yield percent, we begin with our EP weight of 8.5 pounds. We divide it by our AP weight of 12 pounds, and we get a yield percent of 71. Here with the onions, we've basically done the same thing. We've been given the AP and the EP, so we're looking for the trim loss and the yield percent. To go with the trim loss, we started off with 25 kilograms. We ended up with 22.2 kilograms, so if we subtract that, we see the trim loss was 2.8 kilograms. Then we go to figure out our yield percent. Our yield percent is our EP divided by our AP, which will give us a yield percent of 89. Now we're back to leaks and looking for both our yield weight and our yield percent. And again, at the risk of repeating myself too much, I will just pop these numbers up so you can see exactly what's going. Don't forget over here, 18.75 is 18 and 3/4 pounds. I had 19 ounces, so I multiplied 19 by 16 to get 1.1875, the decimal equivalent of 19 ounces in pounds. And then I get my EP, I divide by my AP, I get a yield percent of 94. And the last one is zucchini. I bought 15.6 kilograms. I was left with 14. 15.6 minus 14. I had a trim loss of 1.6 kilograms. I go for the yield percent. My EP is 14 kilograms. My AP, what I originally purchased, is 15.6. Divide those two, get a yield percent of 90%. Let's take a look at the next one. Here it's a little simpler. I've got my list of items. I've got the recipe amount, or the EP amount, if you will, how much I actually need of prepped ingredients. Here's my yield percent. And what this table is going to show us is once we know how much we need in a recipe and we have a yield percent for the ingredient, we will know exactly how much we need to purchase. This way we'll never purchase more than we need and we'll never be caught with less than we should have had. So taking into consideration the formula to get this done, we take the EP amount, we divide it by the yield percent, it gives us the AP. So for asparagus, I need 3 pounds. I'm going to divide it by the yield percent, 0.74 or 71%. I get 4.0540 pounds, or 4 pounds and 1 ounces. I multiply the decimal portion of the pounds by the 16 ounces per pound to get the 1 ounce. Granted, at this stage, the chef may decide, instead of buying 14 pounds and 1 ounce, just get 4 pounds, but that's the chef to make that decision. It's not ours. We simply do the math and present the numbers. Avocado slices, we need 1.5 pounds. It yields 75%. So if I take my 1.5 pounds that I need divided by the yield percent, I see that I'm going to have to buy 2 pounds of avocados to make sure I get 1.5 pounds for my recipe. Banana slices, 5.74 kilograms is needed for the recipe, yield percent of 70%. There's my EP weight divided by my yield percent. I need to purchase 8.2 kilograms of banana slices. And I keep working my way down the exact same way for these. Here's how much I need. Here's my yield percent. Divide my EP by my yield percent, I get my AP amount. Here we're doing the opposite. I know how much I purchased. I know what the yield percent is, so how much is that going to leave me for my recipe? Well, for the scallions, if I purchased 8.5 kilograms and my yield percent is 65%, because they're side by side on the pyramid, I need to multiply these two. There's my AP amount, there's my yield percent, there's how much I need, 5.525 kilograms. I need it to round off to 2 decimal places, so I end up with 5.53 kilograms as my final answer. My melon slices, purchased 12.75 pounds. My yield percent is 55%. I multiply those two, rounding off to the nearest pound. I get 7 pounds of edible portion, or my recipe amount. Cherries, bought 4.25 kilograms at an 82% yield. Again, the AP times the yield percent gives me 3.485 or 3.49 kilograms rounded to 2 decimal places. And the last ingredient, my pineapple, I bought 13.5 kilograms. My yield percent is 50%. Multiply those two, I will be left with 6.75 kilograms. And finally, we're looking at the unit costing formula, the EP unit costing formula. Earlier on, we learned about the AP unit costing formula, and the AP unit costing formula is the AP price divided by the amount of units for that price, and that gives us the AP unit cost, the cost of 1 unit of that ingredient. Well, the EP unit cost is the cost of 1 unit of prepared ingredients. In other words, we've taken that 1 pound or that unit from our AP and we've peeled it or cooked it or boned it or skinned it, and now we have a little bit less. So this is going to help us calculate the true cost of that unit. So the EP unit cost formula, quite simple. We're going to take the AP unit cost that we figured out before. We're going to divide it by the yield percent of that ingredient, and that will give us the EP unit cost. Simple formula that is supplied to you during the test. Let's see how it works. So here's a list of 7 ingredients. Here's our AP cost, and here's the yield percent for each one of those ingredients. Back to our favorite asparagus. We paid 70 cents a pound. It yields 74%. So we're going to do 70 cents divided by 74%. We get a rounded cost for an EP unit cost of 95 cents. So you can see very dramatically the difference in the EP unit cost and the AP unit cost. In this case, it's 25 cents. And that 25 cents is essentially the cost of the 26% that we've cut away that we're not using for this particular recipe. It wouldn't be such a big deal, but we paid for the 26% that is no longer available. So we have to make sure we factor in the cost of our trim loss into our ingredient costs so we get a true selling price later on. Let's continue on with avocado slices. We paid $1.29 a pound. The yield percent is 75%. So the AP unit cost divided by the yield percent, an EP unit cost of $1.72. Again, a marked difference. EP cost, the one that takes into consideration how much we cut away from this, is $1.72 as opposed to our AP cost of $1.29. And you'll notice that our EP cost is usually higher than our AP because we're usually taking things away from ingredients. Banana slices, 82 cents per kilogram AP divided by a yield percent of 70%. Our EP unit cost is $1.17. Broccoli pieces, we're doing the same thing. Yam, diced, and in this case, it doesn't really matter if it's sliced or pieces or diced. We're just looking at pricing here. Hip of beef, our AP unit cost, our yield percent, there's the EP, and finally the salmon at $4.59 a pound AP divided by the yield percent of 82%. We get an EP unit cost of $5.60. You can see here this is dramatic. It's a whole $1.01 more per unit.